Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Pat Taylor, the Science Director of SIMRES, and we come here to today, all of us virtually meeting for the SeaTalk, based here at SIMRES on Saturna Island in the center of the Salish Sea, from within the unceded traditional territories of many Coast Salish peoples who have traditionally used the island. We are grateful to live and work on this land and observe the marine animals, plants, and ecology of this very special place. And today, we are very happy to welcome Aaron Purdy, a marine biologist who is with Ocean Wise, joined in 2019 as the coordinator of the Southern Vancouver Island Cetacean Research Initiative. And he coordinates a Harbour Porpoises survey on Saturna Island, which is now in its third year. Aaron got his Master's of Science from UBC, where he studied the diving physiology of stellar sea lions, and also has experience studying black-tailed prairie dogs in Saskatchewan, and even has experience with researching black howler monkeys in Belize. He's got a ton of research under his belt and has been all over the planet. Welcome, Aaron. I'll meet you back here for Q&A after your presentation. Everyone, if you do have questions while the talk is going on, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring both. And afterwards, we'll open it up for a good session to discuss with Aaron about his research. All right, thank you very much, and take it away, Aaron.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me and then having me here. I'm very excited to talk to you about some of the research and some of the animals that I get to look at through some of my study. So I'll just share my screen here, make sure that it is nice and visible for everybody. Good to go? Perfect. So the main animal that I've been studying as a part of this research project that is taking place on Saturna in conjunction with SIMRES is this animal, the Harbour porpoise. And for the title here, Tiny Body, Big Questions, a look into the life of BC's smallest cetacean. When a lot of people here, I imagine, have seen Harbour porpoises, and I find a lot of the time people don't really think much of them. It's just a small little species. They often quietly go by, and people don't think much of the animal. However, I'm here to convince you that there is some fascinating research going on with these animals, and that it's particularly important that we do that for the protection of this species. So, as I mentioned before, the Harbour porpoise. This is kind of what you often see when you see a Harbour porpoise in the wild, just a small little blip, almost like a wheel rolling through the water. It's often described as a shy species, being described as elusive or nondescript, only seeing it very briefly before it disappears again, and often described as not being particularly exciting. And you can kind of see why. It's a very small, fairly unobtrusive animal, has a dark gray back, that small fin, nothing really that stands out when you first see it in comparison to some of the larger cetaceans that we have in British Columbia, like the killer whale or humpback whale, things along these lines. Once you start exploring into the history of the animal, even just its name, it starts becoming a little bit more interesting. If you take a look at its scientific name, Phastina phasina, this comes from the Greek name for big seal. So maybe a little bit confusion there. This isn't a seal, this is a porpoise. If we take a look at the word porpoise, it comes from the Latin porcopiscus. In medieval Latin, it is a combination of pig and fish. So it's described as a pigfish. All right, even a little bit more confusion there. This isn't a seal, it's not a pig, and it's not a fish. It extends to other languages as well. In Old Norse, the Germanic translation for porpoise, marsvin, is sea swine. In Norwegian, it's nisa, which comes from the Norse word for sneeze. And even in our own country, in Atlantic Canada, these animals are described as puffing pigs. So we can see that there's a little bit of confusion as what to do with this very quiet, unobtrusive animal. If you think about it, these names do kind of make sense. The animal porpoises of all sorts have been used as a food source in many different cultures throughout history. So calling it a pig or swine makes sense. Also, if the main characteristic that you see from this animal is the sound that it makes, that little as it comes to the surface, it does kind of sound like a snuffling pig or perhaps a sneeze as well. All right, so let's dive below the water and take a little bit of a larger look at this animal. Already, it's starting to look a little bit more interesting. We see that it isn't just a all gray animal. There is more to it than that. It has these subtle streaking marks across its side. The dark back and white belly is something called counter shading, helping it to blend into its surroundings from any predators that are looking at it from above. We also see sometimes they have this little chin strap that comes from their mouth as well. So we're starting to see that this is an animal that does have a little bit more complexity to it. These are, as I mentioned before, BC's smallest cetacean. When I say cetacean, that means all whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So it is the smallest one that lives in British Columbia, only getting to about somewhere between 1.2 to 2 meters long, so about the same size as I am tall. And they're usually weighing around 45 to 60 kilograms. These animals belong to a group of cetaceans called odontocetes. Odonto means toothed, cete means whale, so these are the toothed whales. These are some of the species that live in British Columbia with a relative size here. The most famous, of course, being the killer whales that live in our waters, and you can see that it is quite a bit smaller than these other species. Toothed whales in general can be broken up into two main categories, dolphins and porpoises. People often ask what the difference between a dolphin and a porpoise is. A technical thing to look at is actually their teeth. Porpoises are known for having kind of spade-like teeth, so they're kind of shaped like this, whereas dolphins have more of a cone-shaped tooth. Dolphins also have a little bit more of a beak and a curved dorsal fin, whereas porpoises often have a more triangular dorsal fin and a more blunt face in comparison to their dolphin counterparts. These two groups actually diverged 15 million years ago, so they're more genetically different than lions and tigers. And despite that, they still are often mixed up when people see them in the wild. One species that it is often mixed up with is the Dall's porpoise. This is a slightly larger animal. It's usually around 2 meters long, but it does differ from the porpoise largely in their behaviors. These animals are much more fast moving, often seen bow riding, and often a little bit more energetic. Another thing to look for right along the back end of the animal is something called a caudal peduncle that you don't see in a porpoise. That's that little hump of muscle that you can see as this animal comes to the surface there. You see the fin and then that peduncle, a good differentiating thing to look for because both of these species do live around Saturna Island. As you can see here, Dall's porpoises also are much more often seen doing energetic behaviors, spraying up water like this. One frustrating and also interesting aspect is that there are hybridizations of these two species. They are able to interbreed, and there has been evidence that they are able of creating viable offspring as well. So they're quite closely related and able, despite these very different looks, are able to interbreed. So already we're starting to see that this porpoise, there's a lot more to it than we originally thought. So we'll go a little bit into Harbour porpoise biology 101, just some of the main basics. These animals only live about 8 to 10 years, which is fairly short-lived for a cetacean. They kind of live fast and exciting lives, despite the fact that you don't see them moving around very quickly very often. What they eat, they're mostly feeding on schooling fish and squid, often in strong currents. Things like herring are a large part of their diet. We also find that they live in coastal waters, typically less than around 150 meters deep, so very close to shore, a lot in the same areas where people live. And we find that their social structure, it's usually see groups of around 2 to 5 individuals together, but they can be seen in groups much larger, up to 20 or even more. They are globally distributed. However, there has been some recent studies that show that they don't have very much movement across this very broad range that they live in. For instance, populations that are found in California do not intermingle at all with any of the individuals that are found in the Salish Sea. That is different from things like killer whales, where we find the southern resident killer whales. They will swim down as far as northern California during the summer months and swimming up into the Salish Sea. Swim down to California during the winter months, swimming up into the Salish Sea during the summer. So they do have a fairly restricted range in their home range, despite them being fairly widely distributed. Just to give you an idea, in British Columbia, they are a very often cited species. These are reports that have been reported into us at Ocean Wise to the BC Cetacean Sighting Network. We have over 11,000 Harbour porpoise sightings to date, and you can see they are often spotted very close to shore. These animals have been called the aquatic shrew. The reason for this is that shrews are known for having to almost constantly feed, eating every 2 to 3 hours to meet their daily energetic requirements. And harbour porpoises are very, very similar. They have to spend 75% of their time foraging and consume 10% of their body weight daily just to meet their energetic requirements. So as I mentioned before, these are animals that live fast, die young, and largely because they have this a huge energetic demand that they need to be able to meet. Because of this, this means that they're somewhat more susceptible to disturbance that might hinder their foraging. So if there's construction, any sound influences that might be disrupting their ability to forage, it's going to have a great impact on these animals. When it comes to foraging, how are they actually finding their food? Well, they are using echolocation to try to find their food. They are going to be producing sounds with these phonic lips that are then reverberated out through that large structure on front of their head, which is called a melon, and it shoots out into the water at very, very high frequencies, around 130 to 140 kilohertz. For reference, humans can hear up to 20 kilohertz. Dogs can hear up to 60. So this is far past any of those animals, very high-pitched sounds. They send them out into the water, bounce off of either a food source or something that they're trying to see underwater. It bounces back, reverberates through their lower jaw and into their ear, and they're able to use that very similar to an animal that might be able to use sonar. The fact that they're using these very high frequency clicks to be able to echolocate might be an adaptation that they actually have to avoid killer whale predation. These are animals that are often sought out by transient killer whales. And if they're going to be echolocating, sending out these sound clicks into the water, they want to do so at a frequency that is beyond the capability of killer whales to hear. So there's some indication that this might be why they echolocate with these high frequencies. However, despite the fact that they are using that high frequency, there have been studies that show that they do have very sensitive hearing across a very broad range, not just within this high frequency area. So this means that because they have this very wide range of hearing, it might mean that they're even more susceptible to sounds from the environment, whether that's from construction, from vessels, or any other sorts of sound that might be happening out in their environment. Now, you might have caught several different things that I was talking about as I was just going through the life history of these animals that actually put harbour porpoises in particular risk, particularly from anthropogenic effects. These animals are listed as an at-risk species. They're listed as a special concern under both SeaWiC and IUCN protocol. We can see that this is largely because they are their numbers are, while currently at a good comfortable number, they are at risk of decreasing and are particularly susceptible to lots of different anthropogenic effects. We find that harbour porpoises, harbour porpoise strandings are the most common out of all of the whale species in British Columbia. And based off of necropsies of those animals, we do find that the leading causes of death are infectious disease, but we also find that traumatic and anthropogenic causes like entanglements are a very prominent source of death for these animals. So what am I talking about when I say entanglement? This is when an animal gets wrapped up in any sort of fishing gear and it becomes something that's called bycatch. we found that the gill net fishing for salmon is these animals are particularly susceptible to be getting caught up in these gill nets. If you are a very small porpoise, it means that you're not able to lift that heavy weight from these massive nets to be able to reach to the surface, get back up to the surface. So it means that these animals do drown if they become entangled in this type of gear. Annual estimate of porpoise mortality in BC from the salmon net gill fisheries is anywhere from 11 to 102 individuals every year. So if we're constantly taking away this number of individuals from the population, it's going to have a very massive effect overall. Other types of effects that these animals face are physical disturbance. This can come in the form of vessel strikes, being hit by a boat. Because they are small and easy to miss, vessels might not see them as they're traveling at high speeds and strike the animal. Even just the presence of boats, it could physically disturb them, move them out of their feeding area. And because they need to be feeding for so much of their day, 75% of the day is spent in foraging. If they're being pushed away from their primary feeding areas, this can have a huge effect on the animals as well. Other things like coastal development and habitat destruction, once again, that physical disturbance can greatly affect these animals. And then finally, one that is talked about a lot in the news these days, acoustic disturbance. If these animals have a very broad range of hearing, it means that they're particularly susceptible to all sorts of noises that might be made under the water. As I mentioned before, from vessels, from coastal development, all of these things. Chronic hearing loss is going to greatly impact their ability to find food, communicate, and avoid predators. So this is why it becomes so important that we study these animals. Harbour porpoise are an at-risk species that is highly susceptible to anthropogenic effects from humans. And it's important that we understand both the distribution of these animals currently, and then look at how they might be affected by changes in their environment that comes from humans. So I'm going to dive into some of the research, not just that I have done, but also some of the research that is going on with other groups here at Ocean Wise, starting with a case study that took place up in Prince Rupert with some of my colleagues at the North Coast Cetacean Research Initiative. They wanted to look at and try to understand how the use of waters near Prince Rupert are being used by harbour porpoises, and specifically looking at daily and seasonal patterns that these animals were using in that area. And how they went about this is they used both land-based surveys as well as acoustic monitoring using something called a sea pod. This started up in 2016 just as a pilot study. And took place just in one of the entrances towards Prince Rupert. The circle here shows the study site where they both had the land-based surveys covering that range, as well as the dot motioning where the sea pod, this acoustic monitoring technique was. And as you can see, it's a very heavily used area for all sorts of ships. We have ships coming in great numbers through this area, as well as a very large tidal circulation through this area as well. So with heavy tides, it's potentially going to be an important food source area for foraging for these animals, but also has that interaction of lots of vessel traffic as well. So when I say land-based surveys, what does that actually mean? So what it actually entails is we have either volunteers or some employees going out and standing out near the water for 2 hours and just looking for porpoises. They're going to be counting in 10-minute intervals all of the porpoises that they see, also recording some of the weather, the direction of those animals' travel, looking at the behaviors that they might be displaying, as well as vessel traffic activity in that area as well. Using this, we're going to be able to determine how porpoises might be, their presence might be related to vessel presence as well. What they actually found, one reason that they were particularly interested in studying this area is that this has been noted to be an area with very high numbers of porpoises, much beyond that six per group range, even up to 20 individuals. In this study, in this the first couple of years of study, we haven't actually seen that very much, though. The number of porpoises in this area, their mean group numbers were around 0.8, anywhere between 0 and 6 individuals. And the number of porpoises ranged anywhere from 0 to 15, but however, that mean was usually around 1.5. When we take a look at the pie graph on the left here, this is just the number of porpoises per group. And you can see most frequently when we're looking in each 10-minute interval, there was most commonly seen 0 porpoises. That's what the large blue on the right here. But we can see that as it goes up, the most frequently the porpoises were seen were just 1 individual per group. When looking at the boats, this is just to show the main takeaway of the boats on the right here is that it was many different sorts of boats. This MVS, MVL, VF, FV, those are all different types of boats, small motor vessels, large motor vessels, ferry, fishing vessels, sailing boats, ferries, all sorts of vessels are in this area. So it was a very highly used area. Now, here's the large takeaway here. On the graph on the left, this is showing the porpoise index versus the boat index. So what does those actually mean? Boat index is the average number of boats per 10-minute interval in the study site. And the porpoise index is the same thing, average number of porpoises per 10-minute interval in the study site. And what we found is, as you can imagine, there was a negative correlation between the number of boats and the number of porpoises during a 10-minute interval. The more vessels there were, the fewer porpoises there were spotted in that 10-minute interval. They also found that there was some correlation between season, where harbor porpoises were more frequently seen during the winter months as opposed to the summer. This was expected, that they were found year-round, but it was an interesting finding that it was more so during the winter. So I also mentioned that they were using a C-pod. What is this? Well, this is a form of passive acoustic monitoring. They have a underwater microphone that is capable of collecting sounds that are being emitted into the water. The main sounds that they were interested in looking for were marine mammal vocalizations. So this is the sounds that the animals are producing underwater, as well as any environmental or anthropogenic noise. So with that, they're able to determine the presence, whether or not these harbor porpoises are in the study site, as well as in relation to what sort of noises are happening around them when they are spotted. So these are a couple of graphs here. The one on the bottom is just looking at harbor porpoise detection throughout the time that this C-pod was deployed. The main thing to take away here is we can see that right in the middle, there is a fairly large spike of much more harbor porpoise presence, and that was happening right around during the spring. Now, this makes sense because it is potentially very closely related to the herring spawn that is going to be happening in that region during those spring months. We also found that there was a fairly strong dial trend. So this is related to whether the animals are present during the day or night. And we did find that these animals were more likely to be using this area during the day. One final thing, which I don't have a graph here to show, is that once again, porpoise presence was strongly correlated to strong tidal flow. These animals are going to be using the area when the tide is rushing in, coming out, where they're going to be able to find their food in the strong tidal currents. This comes to some of the research that we have going on Saturna. Based off of that pilot study that was going on in Prince Rupert, we were interested in learning a little bit more about the harbor porpoise presence in another area as well, specifically off of East Point. I'm sure many of you recognize this area just based off of the photo there. We wanted to explore what the habitat used by harbor porpoise off East Point was like, particularly in relations to the presence of vessels. When we take a look at the sightings of different whale species around the Southern Gulf Islands, we can see that there are a huge number of whales being spotted. This map is just showing the sighting, I believe, for the past 5 years. And we can see that the number of Harbour porpoises sightings just in this small region is nearly 400 sightings. We can see that Harbour porpoises are a very commonly spotted animal in this region. It's likely that this is a very important spot for them. So what did we go about doing? Well, we've started doing a similar land-based surveys where we are heading out to East Point, once again, in 10-minute intervals, collecting data on the presence of Harbour porpoises, as well as the types of behavior that they're doing, and if the relation to any close by vessels as well. Now, what I'm going to be showing you is much more preliminary data. We are still in the process of looking into it, but I'll be able to show you a little bit from the past 2 seasons that we've been studying these animals. Once again, the graph on the left here is showing the boat index in relation, porpoise index in relation to the boat index. So how frequently porpoises are seen when there are boats nearby. And we do find that there is a negative correlation between boat and porpoise presence. However, one thing to note is that we found that there was both a lower porpoise index and a lower boat index in the East Point site in comparison to the Prince Rupert site. This area has much fewer Harbour porpoises and also appears to have quite a bit less vessel traffic as well. Whether that is related to the oceanographic currents of that area, whether it's a spot that is being particularly not quite as important for feeding, we're not entirely sure. And it's one thing that we hope to explore into the future. We also saw that there was some slight variation just in our 2019 surveys from by month, where there were more Harbour porpoises spotted in September as opposed to in August. But there, once again, the stronger correlation of when porpoises were present was related to tide more so than time. Now, let's take a look at 2020. Once again, just very preliminary results here. First, we'll draw your attention to the table in the top right. We found, for some reason, the number of porpoises that we found in the 2 months that we did our study in 2019, there were 298 spottings of Harbour porpoises. And in 2020, only 57. So why there's such a difference between these 2 years is particularly interesting. We also saw that there were more vessels spotted in 2019 as opposed to 2020. Why this is, we're not entirely sure. It possibly has something to do with how we were collecting the data from year 1 versus year 2. In the first year, we were collecting data more condensed just during the summer months, whereas in this past year, we've been collecting it more spread out throughout the entire year. One thing to note here as well, on the graph on the bottom right, we can see that there were much more porpoises present in the summer months as opposed to the winter. So this is the reverse of what we were seeing in Prince Rupert. So it's clear that there is some seasonal variation of porpoise distribution in different areas depending on what area that you're in. So what are some potential changes versus year 1 versus year 2 that might have affected porpoise presence? Well, the first thing that comes to mind, as I'm sure you all are aware of, is the interim sanctuary zone that was created for southern resident killer whales that was put in place in 2020. Whether or not that was affecting the number of boats and thereby the number of porpoises is yet to be determined. It could also potentially be affecting the presence of other marine mammals. If there are more transient killer whales, for instance, in this study site, it might have deterred more of the porpoises from using that area. Other potential things to look into are acoustic changes. Maybe there was some change in the acoustic soundscape of this area in this past year, and potentially habitat changes as well. One thing that we would love to be able to do is explore what the soundscape is like in off of East Point here in our coming season. We do plan on continuing this survey into the coming year, and if we are able to do that, that is something that we might be able to get this other form of detection, not just the visual surveys, but see if there are porpoises there, but just not being shown above water. So what are the key home takeaways here? Well, the first thing is that harbor porpoises are small, but they are an at-risk species. They are particularly difficult to study due to their shyness around boats. But it's very important that we learn about these animals, where they are living, and how we can best protect them, because they are so susceptible to all of these different anthropogenic changes. With that, that is I'm already over my time, so I'll leave it at that. But if you do have any questions, I would love to hear from you. This study is going to be continuing on into 2021 as well. So if you are interested in becoming involved, we do use volunteers to collect surveys, collect data through our surveys. Feel free to send me an email right there, aaron.purdy@ocean.org, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was a great presentation. Yeah, and actually, yeah, we'll dive into questions here. We do actually have a couple. One from Ruth Joy here, asking that in the location of the sea pod, could the boats be timing their passage with tidal states?
That is certainly something that would be able to look into. I imagine the question is related to limit the presence of vessels during the time when porpoises are present. Definitely would be something to look into for regulations to help protect the animals. I'm not sure if anything has, if that's been suggested before, but definitely something that could potentially have a great impact.
Excellent. I have actually another one here from Tom Moore, where he sees two trends around Saturna in recent years. Actually, an increased number of transient orcas, yet the transients are in higher numbers, with a decrease of numbers of harbor porpoises. Is there a correlation on this? You mentioned briefly about how like transient orcas have been known to feed on harbor porpoises. Like, is that, yeah, are transient orcas regularly feeding on porpoises?
Absolutely. That's a definitely very probable cause of some type of correlation. If we are seeing a larger number of transient killer whales around Saturna, it's highly likely that that is going to affect porpoise behavior. I believe from a relatively recent study, harbor porpoises are the third most common species that transient killer whales will go after, after harbor seals and sea lions. So if they are around, then it is very likely that porpoises are going to be changing their behavior in relation to that.
Yeah. Oh, and a question from JH here, actually, on the numbers that you're actually seeing for in 2020. How much of like that lower boat traffic was related to the pandemic? Was that a large factor in seeing that reduced numbers?
That's a very good question. I'm sure a lot of you have probably noticed shifts in being on Saturna, seeing some shifts in boat traffic, particularly from the United States. We did find, from what I understand, there have been a lot of people buying boats this past year. So we have a greater number of Canadians who are traversing our waters. That is, it's hard to say specifically if that's why the decrease in boats from between the 2 years. It's definitely a possibility. One instance, which I kind of touched on a little bit, is that the way that we collected data in 2019, most of our studies, our surveys were around August and September, whereas in 2020, we've been collecting surveys from August all the way up until even collecting surveys just yesterday. So because we're doing some more surveys during the winter months, it's potential that that is why we're seeing fewer boats. However, with such large numbers, there's probably something else there as well.
Right. Interesting. Another one actually here from Ralph Cartar, that might a tested relationship between porpoise index and vessel index be strengthened by decomposing each index into its elements, that is individual boat types.
Yeah, absolutely. And if, as you can probably imagine, a large commercial ship or something like a ferry is going to be making quite a bit more noise than a small sailboat with a little outboard motor. So in comparison, they are going to be quite different. One thing I can tell you, at least for the East Point data, almost all of the vessels that we see are small motor vessels. So things that are likely recreational boats and some fishing vessels. So whether or not it's going to have a huge change, that is something we haven't looked into yet, but my guess is that it's probably not going to make a huge difference because the general size of the vessel isn't that large.
Oh, and sorry, question here from Karen Lindsay. Review again porpoise presence in relation to tides. I think, yeah, I'm asking, sorry, you can message again too, Karen, if I'm not getting it right, but yeah, how much of like movement to the porpoise is just reliant on tide movement?
They do seem to be very strongly using their presence is strongly related to the strong tidal currents, and that is likely related to the fact that they are using these tidal currents to feed, and that is where they're going to be spending most of their time. If they are spending 75% of their time in areas with strong flow, looking for that food, that's the places where they're going to be found.
Right. Oh, actually, okay, got a few more questions here, and then I think we'll call it there. But yeah, actually, I have someone here. Rachel Cherish is wondering if there's any possibility for employment. Got a background.
I guess you could always send an email to aaron.purdy@ocean.org. I'll be able to put you in touch with the right people, but definitely always looking for volunteers, particularly if you are on Saturna, interested in getting involved in helping count some porpoises. It's much nicer now that the weather's getting a little bit nicer outside. Want to spend 2 hours going out looking for porpoises, we'd be happy to have you.
Excellent. Yep, there you go. You might have a data analyst coming your way.
There you go.
And sorry, a question here from Diane Cohen Jordanson. Are the transient whales coming in higher numbers because of climate change or increase in their population? Yeah.
That one I can't say for sure because I personally don't know. I haven't looked into whether or not there are higher transient numbers. It sounds like based off of some people's personal experience, they do feel that they are seeing more transient killer whales in the area. One thing I can tell you is that transient killer whales across British Columbia, their population has been slowly increasing. So they are growing in numbers to some extent. They're around 500 transient killer whales, and that number is slowly increasing each year. So that could potentially be a reason why we're seeing this shift in porpoise behavior.
A question actually here, a good one from Colleen Sheridan, actually asking about for the land-based surveys, essentially when you're looking for these, like how hard is it basically for a needle in a haystack? Like her question is, how much does the rougher sea state affect the ability to spot?
It absolutely does affect the ability to spot. That's a great question. We actually only are able to complete these surveys in Beaufort, anything less than Beaufort 3. So once it gets up to winds above 15 kilometers an hour-ish, it starts getting very difficult to spot these porpoises because they're so small. As soon as whitecaps start forming, it is almost impossible to reliably find all the porpoises that are in that area. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's another reason why studying this animal is a great thing. I only have to go out there when the weather's nice. So.
And actually kind of related on that, Stefan Lindgren, even just asking like for basically getting a census on numbers, do you actually have a rough population estimate for Harbour porpoises? Since I guess a lot of it's based on those land-based observations. For
there is an estimate of population numbers, but how reliable it is not as confident for something as large as something like the southern resident killer whales, where we know exactly how many individuals there are. With harbor porpoises, the estimate is much less refined, and is another reason why they are listed as this special concern, because changes in their population are a little bit harder to detect. So that's a fantastic question.
All right, yeah, I've got a couple more here that I can, and then we'll I think we'll call it there. So it was actually previously Dr. Lauren McWhinney, previously worked with SIMRES, was suggesting that the frequency used for Jasco's hydrophones are actually perceptible to harbor porpoises as well as the southern residents. Has this angle of sound impact been explored?
It hasn't been explored, but it would definitely be something to look into. If there are, as I mentioned before, these harbor porpoises do have a very broad range of hearing. If there are any devices that are under the water in their habitat that are producing sound, it could definitely potentially have an impact on these animals' ability to forage, and even just it might act as a deterrent to them foraging in that area. So it's certainly something to look into, something that that I'm not aware if there has been any research into, but yeah, definitely something that would be definitely of interest.
All right. Actually, and on that about harbor porpoises being susceptible to fishing practices, like the high number of deaths that can occur through netting, are there any sustainable fishing methods that mitigate this, that are safe for harbor porpoises? Yeah, so that's a question from Lori Lowen.
That's another great question. Once anything that is single line fishing in comparison to things like gill nets is going to be have anything that puts less material into the water is going to be, these animals are going to be much less susceptible to that. So in general, that is the case for all cetaceans and large whale or animals that are in the water that entanglement is a problem. So yeah, that's kind of the main takeaway.
Okay, nice. So I'm going to call it for just two more questions, everyone. I know everyone has great questions, but I'll call it here with just two more. Okay, so Joan Lopez then asks about, so again, for the porpoises being with tide changes, during tide change at East Point, the tide rips get quite rough. Are you able to see the porpoises in these rips from a land-based point, given that it is so far offshore? Rough water can really make it difficult to see them.
Yeah, that's a great question. In the area where we are doing this study, we only go 400 meters out, or looking 400 meters out from the land, from the point where we're studying, which does make it a little bit easier to spot, because like you said, in these strong rips, it gets a little bit more rough and a little bit harder to see. With the binoculars that we have, and also limiting how far we are actually looking for these animals, with some training and with to make, if you know what you're looking for, you still can spot the animals, thankfully, and we do make sure that we are looking in those areas. That's a great question, though.
Sorry about what the last one here from Bob Bruce. Could actually the decline in numbers be linked to also declines in forage fish? Has that been investigated at all?
That is another fantastic question. What these animals, one thing I didn't touch on as much, another reason why these animals are particularly susceptible to anthropogenic effects is because they are sharing a food source with us. Herring is a particularly important food source for harbor porpoises. This is a commercially important fish. If there is any competition that is happening between humans, any changes in their prey's distribution definitely is going to potentially have a large impact on these animals. Whether or not there's been any research specifically into harbor porpoises, there's not that I'm aware of. It is a relatively less studied cetacean, and so that's definitely something that we'd be interested in looking in.
Neat. Very interesting. Wow. Oh, thank you very much, Aaron. That's incredible research that's going on. These guys are really important to study, and it's really fascinating to know about them. Who they are, these little guys that seem to kind of almost sneak under the radar.
Exactly, right. I'm happy to hear so many questions. If there are anyone didn't get their question asked, please feel free to send me an email, aaron.purdy@ocean.org. Me or one of my colleagues definitely will hopefully be able to answer any questions that you have.
Excellent. Thank you so much again for coming and giving this presentation to us, Aaron. It's really appreciated.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
All right, and so everyone, just a little bit of wrap up for some SIMRES information, some SIMRES news to give everyone. Just want to thank everyone very much for joining us here today. It's great to have people coming out for these talks because, of course, we're really interested in these talks, as Aaron presented here, and we know everyone else is as well. So this is fantastic that everyone showed up today. And I do just want to let everyone know that next Saturday will be the SIMRES annual general meeting. This will be via Zoom, and if you remember, you should have already received your email with our reports and a link to the meeting. And if you're not yet a member, you can and would like to attend, you can still join anytime on our website. Just go to simres.ca. Just to let you know that it is actually still only $10 for this last week to join as a member. And as SIMRES is an independent volunteer organization, we really do appreciate your support. It's what keeps us going. Here are a few ways that you can also help us to achieve our goals and continue to have great talks like Aaron's today, as well as continue even doing research and education through SIMRES. Please become a member. Please support us with donations. You can also sign up for our newsletter, and please follow us on social media. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we're out there on all of them, giving out for news on events, but as well, just science. We'll often be posting just about information going on around. There will be a recording. I did see someone ask about that as well, that yes, there is, like, this presentation is recorded. It will be going up through both onto our YouTube, which a link is also available through our website to get to our YouTube channel. And our next Sea Talk coming up is actually going to be on rockfish in our local area and discussing the rockfish conservation areas that are in place in the Gulf Islands. Date hasn't been finalized yet, but keep an eye out for it, that this will be coming up this spring. Thank you again, and we'll see everyone next time.